We're looking at the second in our series. This one's called The Chaos You Encounter. And in recent weeks we've seen, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced all across Texas and Florida and the Caribbean, especially Puerto Rico, and just how those major storms swept through those areas, and these people's lives have been turned upside down, and many have lost everything they own, just completely wiped out. And their situation is an example of what this series and tonight's message is really about. For the people that are affected by Harvey and Irma and Maria, it really doesn't matter how together their lives were the day before the storm. They discovered once the storm hit, in an all too real way, how life is unpredictable and how this world is really unstable. And you never know when everything about your existence will suddenly spin into chaos. We get these frequent reminders that the world around us isn't nearly as stable as we would like it to be. And some of you are seeing it happen day after day on a more personal level. Maybe in your marriage or your family or your job, your world is becoming increasingly unstable, and there's a whole lot of shaking going on around us. And things happen, and it seems to shake you to your core. And when that happens, it doesn't matter really how together you are personally, because the chaos around you still affects you in a very real way. What do you do when your world comes crashing down, when something happens that you just never expected to happen? What do you do? Well, we're in week 2 of our series called Unmovable, and it's about finding strength in the midst of chaos. And that's a good way to describe the world we live in. It's often chaotic. Anybody ever feel like your life is just chaotic? Okay? Last week we talked about how to deal with the chaos we create for ourselves, both through sinful willfulness and through misguided and unwise decisions. We talked about the need to confront the chaos head on, asking the right questions, listening to the right people, and taking the right steps in follow-up. Well, tonight we're going to talk about confronting a different kind of chaos, and this is the kind of chaos we encounter that isn't of our doing. But it is a result of this crazy, mixed-up, fallen world in which we live in. And you personally may not be prone to chaos, but I can assure you that the world is prone to chaos. And many of the people around you are, and sometimes it really doesn't take much for pandemonium to break out right on your very doorstep. So tonight I want to talk about dealing with the chaos around you. The chaos that occurs in situations that you had no control over, that you couldn't see coming, that you just really couldn't anticipate. How do you stand strong? Well, we're going to look at Acts 27 tonight, a story that the Apostle Paul was involved in. He was on a ship in the middle of a storm, and everyone around him was losing their minds, and he stood strong in the midst of it all. And the events of this story kind of parallel the steps that we need to take in order to respond rightly to the chaos that we encounter. So we won't take time to read the whole chapter, but you can read it while I'm talking, or you can mark it and read it later. Acts 27 begins with Paul setting out on a ship for Italy. And when you're reading through the book of Acts, you notice that chapter 27, the pronouns kind of change from he to we. And it's assumed then that at this time, Luke, who actually wrote the book of Acts, is along for the ride. And so he's experiencing this with Paul. And when Paul got on the ship, his life was already really pretty chaotic. He was on his way to Italy, to Rome, to stand trial before Caesar. And quite possibly he could be sentenced to death. And we know that he ended up dying there because of his decision to go there. But the chaos in Paul's life really wasn't of his own doing, other than the fact that he had been faithful to preach the gospel. This chaos in Paul's life was the result of the fallen world in which Paul lived, and the fact that there were people out to get him, and the government was against the teaching of Jesus Christ. So after he boarded the ship and they started on their way to Rome, things went from bad to worse, because the ship, which contained 276 people plus cargo, ran into some troubling weather. And we're going to see that no one really knew how to handle it until Paul finally stepped up. And as we work through this story, there's three observations we want to make about chaotic situations that I want to draw your attention to. If you want to be the kind of person who can stand strong in a culture of chaos, if you want to be the kind who keeps their head on straight when everybody else is losing theirs, there's three general truths that we're going to talk about that we need to keep in mind. First one is this. The chaos will never fix itself. Neither can you count on others to do it for you. Problems rarely, if ever, just go away. Anybody ever notice that? You can't really just ignore them and expect them just to take care of themselves. In fact, they usually get work. And the second law of thermodynamics, if you were in science and all that kind of stuff, it's about the inevitability that things go from order to disorder. Our problems certainly fit into that category. If left untended, they go from bad to worse. One of my favorite things to do when I have a noise in my car that I don't know what it is, turn up the radio. But that never works well, because you can't just ignore the problem. So, as the ship sailed into the storm, they just couldn't cross their fingers and hope that the storm wouldn't do what storms can do. They needed a plan and they needed to take action, but they just weren't willing to do it, or they didn't know how to do it. And as the ship sailed into troubled waters, Paul warned them in verse 10. This is going to be disastrous. He wanted them to put on the brakes and wait out the storm and spend the winter where they were, because these waters were considered really unsailable, unnavigable in the late winter or late fall and early winter months. Then Luke writes in verse 11 of chapter 27, but the centurion, the guy who was in charge, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Their advice was to go on ahead. Let's just go for broke. There are three phrases in this little part of the story that kind of jumped out at me as I was going through this. One phrase is in verse 9. Much time had been lost. Now, I want to ask you, when chaos hits, isn't that really what happens? You tend to lose a lot of time. It's the ultimate time killer. And if you find a way, or until you find a way to confront the chaos, you just keep losing time. Just like one thing after another. Mike had the opportunity to maybe lose a bunch of hours working on his truck, but he found them, because it wasn't what he thought it was. So he got that time back. But chaos can do that. It can steal your time. Second phrase. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. This is kind of what chaos does to us as well. We just give up and we give way to the chaos. We just say, okay, I'm done fighting. I'm just going to go with it. And we let it drive us along. We might be too tired to fight back, too discouraged to resist, and we just let the situation drive us along. And then there's the third phrase that jumps out at me. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on. Paul had told the leaders what to do. We should just wait here until it's safe to sail. But the majority wanted to keep going. And there are times, especially in crisis situations, where the majority opinion is the last opinion that you want to have in your life. It's the last group you want to listen to. That kind of mentality of the majority rarely moves you in the direction of wise decision making. A few years ago, I heard the story about a church who was on the verge of choosing a new pastor. And their church government was such that the pastors were chosen by a majority vote. And so they had come down to two different choices. One was a 32-year-old hotshot, and the other was a 50-some-year-old grandfather with a decades-long history of ministry. Now, I kind of right away navigated to the 50-some-year-old guy. I'm not a grandpa yet, but that's kind of, I said, I like that guy already. But a couple of the leaders in the church said, this young guy, this 32-year-old, I don't think he's quite ready for the responsibility that we're going to give him to lead this church. We need this older, seasoned man of God to lead our church into the future. But the majority didn't agree. The young man, they said, he's going to bring in young members. He's a more dynamic preacher. He's visionary. That's who we want. And so that's who the majority took. 2 years later, the church was broke, the pews were empty, and the hotshot was no longer there and no longer in ministry because of a scandal that he'd gotten involved in. The fact is that age really had nothing to do with it. The problem was that the majority couldn't see the wise decision that some of the key leaders maybe could see. And what I'm saying here is that there's going to be times when, in the midst of the chaos, you might have to stand up and be the voice of reason. You might have to stand up and stand alone against the tide of public opinion and choose to do what you know is right rather than what everyone else for this passing moment thinks is right. One thing is that chaos will never fix itself, and most of the time you can't count on the nameless faces of they fixing it either. So what can you do? Here's the next observation. You need to acknowledge that God is in control of even the most out-of-control situations. I like this quote here. God is not the author of chaos. He is the redeemer of chaos. God is not the author of disorder or destruction. He is the redeemer of disorder and destruction. People ask, well, what about the storms? Didn't God create those storms and send them to punish people? And that might have been how it was viewed back in the Middle Ages, but today we understand a lot more about global weather conditions and how, hot air and cold air hit and mix, and there's, we live in a world where storms happen and stuff happens. God didn't create the chaos in Texas and Florida and the Caribbean, but I'll tell you this, He is there in the presence of His people. He is there to redeem the situation. And in tonight's story about Paul, we see how Paul reminded his fellow passengers that regardless of how things may appear on the surface, regardless of how rough the waters look, God is in control. When things were at their worst, God gave this word to Paul. And he passed it on to everyone else. Verse 25, he said, "So keep up your courage, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as He told me." And a few verses later, Luke says this. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of all of them. The best thing that you can do in the midst of an out-of-control situation is to acknowledge that, above and beyond everything else, God is still in control. His being in control doesn't mean that we'll never face hard times. His being in control doesn't mean that we're never going to encounter chaos. In fact, Jesus promised, in this world you will have problems. And if it ended there, we'd just say, oh boy. But it doesn't. He says, "But take heart, for I have overcome the world." I'm in control. But God being in control does mean that in spite of all the disorder around us, I like this verse too, the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor is His ear too dull to hear. Well, I don't know about you, but more times than I can count in my life, I've had to stop in the midst of my momentary panic and remind myself who really is in control of the situation. God's message to the Apostle Paul during the midst of the storm was, in effect, I'm with you, you're going to get through this, don't worry. Take heart. And I want to tell you tonight that you will too. George Whitefield, who was an 18th century evangelist, he said this. By the way, this was attributed to a bunch of different people, but I like it being attributed to him. We are immortal until our work on earth is done. We won't die until our work on earth is done. And then, we can't do a thing to add to our lives. We're going to go home. God is in control of even the most out-of-control situations. And if you want to keep your head about you, if you want to learn to stand strong, remind yourself of this truth every day of your life. God is in control. When you get up out of bed, God is in control of the day. There's nothing that's going to come before me that hasn't already passed through God's hand and that He and I can't handle together. God is in control. The first two observations from this story is that chaos isn't about to fix itself, and most likely the majority won't make it any easier. But God is in control and He can redeem any amount of chaos. So where does that lead us to? Well, the next step. Take charge wherever and whenever you can take charge. So after the boat had taken a beating in the storm and they had thrown most of their cargo overboard, the stuff that they were taking to trade, and they had gone 2 weeks without even eating, you got to really be seasick on a ship, and the sea really has to be roiling for it to be 2 weeks for you not to eat. I mean, that's a good storm. You know, we think the ships in the Caribbean, as Maria was going by and the other hurricanes, you know, 3 or 4 days and phew, it was gone. Well, these guys were in this storm for 2 weeks and seasick, hadn't eaten anything. And it had gotten to the point where Luke writes in verse 27, when neither the sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Can you imagine being in the middle of the ocean where you can't even see the sun or the stars for days and days? Doesn't sound good. And so at this point here, Paul speaks up once again, basically saying, gentlemen, I hate to tell you I told you so, but I told you so. That's exactly right. You should have listened to me before and you didn't. We should have stayed where we were, but maybe now you're ready to listen. You might not be able to still the storm as it squalls around you. You may not be able to change the tide of public opinion, or change the economy, or control what some political leader might do. You may not even be able to control what your wife or your husband or your kids or your boss or your customers might do. But you can control what you do. And you speak the voice of leadership and you set the example of leadership to those around you. There's another phrase in the text that really jumped out at me. It's in verse 33. Paul says this, "For the last 14 days you have been in constant suspense." A lot of us know what that's like. And maybe it has lasted a lot longer than 14 days. I think of the Mentos. They're in suspense right now. Not sure exactly what's going to happen. And if nothing happens until March, it's going to be a lot longer than 14 days. Right? But that's what chaos wants to do to us. It wants to create a nagging, never-ending atmosphere, never-ending state of not knowing, being in suspense. So based on what takes place in this story, here's 3 things that I would advise us to do when we're surrounded by chaos. First, I would encourage you to take care of yourself. Verse 33, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. The crisis had been going on for 2 weeks, and it wasn't over yet. Almost, but not yet. God had promised Paul that they were going to make it through it, but it wasn't over yet. So the best thing they could do at this very moment was tend to themselves. So Paul told them to eat. Oftentimes, the first thing you do in the midst of a crisis is to stop taking care of yourself. You start to panic. You either don't eat, or you just eat all the time. Right? That nervous eating. I'm always hungry. Or you sleep all day, or you don't sleep at all because you're so worried. You're either depressed and you go to sleep all day, or you don't sleep at all. You either completely withdraw emotionally, or you blow up at every little thing that comes your way. And people try to medicate the situation with alcohol or food or drugs or shopping or any other number of things. If there's chaos going all around you and you're in a constant state of not knowing what might happen, my first words to you would be this: take care of yourself. Eat right, go to sleep at night, maybe take a walk every day or exercise a little bit, go out and ride your horse. Those things are going to help you maintain your emotional equilibrium. I don't know about you, but there's something about being on the back of a horse. It's just like, and if the horse is behaving, then it's even better. You know? You get up on a horse and it's kind of like, all is right here. I was thinking the other day, the last time, somebody was asking me, you know, have you been having any fun lately? I said, well, I said, live on a lake. Haven't had a boat in the water for 4 or 5 years. Haven't ridden horse since last October with Caleb and Jenny and my sister-in-law Iris from South Carolina. A year ago, October. So I'm thinking, I better start taking some of my own advice here and take care of myself. But these things are going to help us maintain that emotional equilibrium. Secondly, oops, I forgot. Paul urged them to eat. Lighten your load. Verse 38, when they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Now, why would they get rid of the food? Well, because they wouldn't need it anymore. Instead, they needed the ship to be lighter so that they could get closer to shore. There's something about a crisis that really helps us define what really matters, what we really need in order to stand strong. And there are going to be times when it's going to be necessary to get rid of all the unnecessary clutter and useless baggage in your life. I'm not talking about your husband or your wife or your kids. Those are needed clutter and baggage. You got to keep them. Okay? But all of us have some amount of clutter in our lives. Maybe it's a friendship or a relationship that isn't leading us in a good direction. Maybe it's a financial obligation that is draining our resources. Maybe we're wasting our time in an unproductive area, which prevents us from doing those things which matter the most. And I know, like in churches, they say that 20% or 20% of your effort gives you 80% of your results. And I think a lot of times that's true in our daily lives as well as individuals. 20% of our efforts gives us 80% of our results. And then we spend the rest of the 80% of our time working to try to get that other 20%, and we're just bogged down. We may not be able to control the elements of the storm in our life, but we strengthen our position when we lighten our load. Look at your life and ask yourself, what do I really need? What really matters most? What can I do without? What areas can I kind of put on the back burner for a while so that I can lighten my load and let go of some of the clutter in my life? And then the third thing, I keep forgetting to show you the verses. Get ready to do your part. Now, I've probably told this joke here, but there was a flood came, and a guy was sitting on his front steps as the flood waters rose, and a canoe came by, and they said, hey, you want to get in? I'll take you to safety. He said, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. And the floodwaters continued to rise, and pretty soon he was sitting up on top of his roof, and a motorboat came by, and they said, hey, get in, we'll save you. And he goes, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. Pretty soon the guy's sitting on top of his chimney, and a helicopter flies over, and they drop a line to him, and they say, come on, climb up the rope, and we'll save you. And he goes, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. Pretty soon he's washed off, he drowns, he gets to heaven, and he asks God, God, why didn't you save me? I was trusting you, I was waiting for you to save me. And God said, well, I said a canoe, a powerboat, and a helicopter. What more do you want? You know, sometimes we have to do something on our own. Sometimes we have to, instead of waiting for God to come into our difficult situation and make things exactly right, without any effort on our part, God's waiting for us to do something. We want God to rescue us and drop us to safety without us ever being inconvenienced. But that's not the way it works most of the time. Most of the time it works for us the way it worked for those on board the ship in Acts 27. The boat was coming up to shore. They had lightened it as much as they could. Verse 41, the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow was stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. They were so close, but still a couple of 100 yards away. Still in a little bit of danger, still in possibly drowning and being killed in this storm. So what do? Well, here's what the centurion in charge said. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. Okay, you guys, anybody here can swim? Yeah, I can swim. Okay, jump overboard and swim ashore. Oh, wait a minute. So they did that. And then, verse 44, the rest were to get there on planks or other pieces of the ship, and in this way, everyone reached land safely. You see, in the midst of the chaos, there's times when we're going to need to swim with all of our might. We're going to need to do something. We're going to need to swim with all of our might. And then there are going to be times when we're going to need to hang onto a plank with all of your might. But you need to do all that you can do in order to get to shore, whether it's swim or hang onto a plank. God doesn't come into your life like a butler, drawing your bath and brewing your tea and ironing your newspaper and helping you get on your slippers and all of that kind of stuff. That's not the role that God plays in our life. God can get you through any chaotic situation, and you can be sure that He will. Because you are immortal until your work here is done. But you can also be sure that in order to get through the chaos, you're going to have to do some work. You're going to have to do something. You're going to have to do your part. You're going to have to swim, or you're going to have to grab some driftwood and dog paddle that final distance to shore. Those who stand strong in a culture of chaos are those who refuse to surrender to the chaos. They won't just give up and give way to the storm and let it drive them along. And though they may momentarily be a victim of circumstance, they refuse to remain a victim of any kind for any length of time, because they know that God is in control. They know that He's going to see them through whatever might come their way. The cool thing about having God in your life is that it's not that you're never going to face problems, but it's that you're never going to face problems alone any longer. And you can rest assured that He says, and I think this isn't a Bible verse, but there's a saying that if He brings you to it, He will bring you through it. And on the other side, you're going to be stronger than when you went in, because He's with you and He strengthens you and He brings you through it. And He's going to see us through whatever might come. And for that reason, even during an extended time of not knowing, those who stand strong are able to say, you know what, I'm prepared to do my part. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to lighten my load. I'm going to do what I can, and I'm going to swim as far as I need to swim, and I'm going to dog paddle as far as I need to dog paddle. And when I can't do that anymore, I'm going to hang on to God's promise that He's going to see me through this tough situation, because He promises He will. And here's our closing thought. You have no control over the chaos around you, but you have control over you. Whenever and wherever you can, make a leadership choice, set a leadership example, and be willing to do your part. Let's pray. Father God, we thank You for Your goodness to us. We thank You for Your faithfulness. God, we thank You that there's nothing that comes our way that You're not in control. You're in control of every situation. And God, we thank You that You also enable us to do our part. You give us that strength. You give us that guidance, that understanding, that care. And God, I just thank You for that. And I pray that we might all be encouraged to do what we need to do in every situation we find ourselves in, but to really rely on you to show us what it is and to give us the strength to do it. Now, God, I ask you blessing upon each one here. We think of the Matfield and Morgan family. God, I just ask that you would minister to them during this difficult time. We pray, God, that you would just have your hand upon them and that your will would be done. We just thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.